Every morning, millions of people repeat the same simple habit. We enjoy a sweet, potassium-rich banana, and a few seconds later, we toss the peel straight into the trash without thinking twice. At that very same time, many gardeners walk through a garden center and spend $30 on synthetic fertilizer, paying for nutrients that were sitting in their own kitchen just moments before. Welcome back to Earthly Delights. I'm truly glad you're here. Today, we're going to look at banana peels in a way that may completely change how you think about kitchen waste. That peel you threw away this morning is actually one of the most useful, nutrient-rich, potassium-packed materials in your home. But here is the important part. Simply throwing it on top of your garden soil is not the miracle solution many people online make it sound like. In this video, we're going to dig into the real science of healthy soil. I'll share 5 practical, science-backed banana peel tricks that can help you build stronger roots, support heavier fruiting, and create a living soil system filled with active earthworms and beneficial microbes. When used the right way, that humble peel can become part of a garden that slowly begins to feed itself. So are you ready to stop buying fertility and start building it from the ground up? Let's get into it. Part 1. The Ancestral Wisdom and the Modern Dilemma. To truly understand the value of what we are holding, we have to go back far before modern fertilizer labels and laboratory formulas. This story does not begin in a clean research facility. It begins more than 7,000 years ago in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, in a place known as Cook Swamp. There, archaeologists found buried evidence of bananas being carefully and intensively cultivated. That matters because Cook Swamp is one of the rare places on Earth where human beings developed agriculture independently. Those early growers did not have garden centers, plastic bottles of liquid feed, or bags of synthetic minerals. They worked with what the land gave them. They returned plant material back to the soil, letting every leftover stem, leaf, and peel become part of the next cycle of growth. That is one of the oldest lessons in farming. Fertility is not supposed to be a one-way transaction. It is a loop. The soil grows the plant feeds the soil, and life continues. But in the early 20th century, the way many people thought about plant nutrition began to change. Fertility slowly shifted from something we built in the soil into something we bought in a bag. Today, the global potash industry is worth more than $30 billion a year. Much of what it sells is soluble mineral salt, mined from the earth and designed to dissolve quickly. The problem is that what dissolves quickly can also wash through the soil quickly after heavy rain. So the cycle becomes simple. You buy potassium, water carries a portion of it away, and then you are told to buy more. But what if we could step out of that cycle? A banana peel works very differently from those fast-dissolving products. It breaks down slowly, feeds the biology in the soil, and can leave the ground better than before. So the real question is this: why did we forget such a simple practice, and how do we bring it back the right way? Part 2. The Science of the Peel. Myths, Facts, and the NPK Truth. Before we get into the actual tricks, we need to clear up one big misunderstanding. If you have spent any time reading gardening posts online, you may have seen people claim that banana peels have an almost magical NPK ratio of 0.2542. Let me say this plainly: that number is not realistic. Think about it from a basic plant science point of view. A banana peel is part of a living plant. Living plants need proteins for structure and function, and proteins contain nitrogen. So the idea that a banana peel has absolutely zero nitrogen does not make biological sense. On top of that, a fresh banana peel is roughly 80% to 85% water. If most of it is water, it cannot also be 42% potassium in its fresh form. The more reasonable, defensible numbers are much lower. When banana peels are completely dried, their NPK is around 0.6 to 0.4, 11.5. When they are fresh and still full of water, that drops to about 0.1, 0.1, 2.3. Besides potassium, banana peels also contain useful micronutrients such as calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and iron. But here is the part many gardeners miss. Plant roots cannot directly eat a raw banana peel. If you throw a fresh peel on top of the soil, it may take a very long time to break down fully, even up to 2 years in some conditions. During that time, it can temporarily lock up nutrients and even act like a barrier instead of a benefit. To release its real value, we need help from the quiet workers in the soil: fungi, bacteria, and earthworms. Once you understand that, banana peels stop being garden folklore and become a practical soil building tool. Now let me show you how to use them properly. Part 3. Trick 1. Dried banana peel powder. The potassium concentrate. This brings us to trick number 1, dried banana peel powder. Have you ever grown a tomato plant that looked absolutely beautiful, with thick stems and deep green leaves, but when harvest time came, it gave you only a few small, disappointing fruits? That plant was not being lazy. It was likely missing the right balance of nutrition. Nitrogen helps build leafy green growth, but potassium plays a major role in the parts most gardeners are really waiting for. It helps move water and sugars through the plant, supports flowering, strengthens stems, improves fruit development, and helps plants handle drought and disease pressure. When plants run low on potassium, you may see leaf edges turn yellow, then dry and scorch brown. So how do we use banana peels in a more effective way? The key is drying them first. A fresh peel contains so much water that its nutrients are diluted. But when you dry the peel until it becomes crisp and easy to snap, then grind it into powder, you remove that water and concentrate the potassium many times over. Chemical analysis shows that dried banana peel powder can contain more than 11% potash by weight, which makes it one of the richest free organic potassium sources most gardeners can make at home. The process is simple. Save your banana peels, dry them in a low oven, a dehydrator, or on a sunny windowsill until they are fully dry. Then grind them into a coarse powder. Sprinkle 1 to 2 tablespoons around the base of your plants and lightly scratch it into the top layer of soil. As the powder breaks down, it feeds the microbes and earthworms that help turn tired dirt into living soil. Another advantage is storage. Once fully dried, this powder can be kept in a sealed jar for months, so you can collect peels through the season and build your own free potassium supply over time. Part 4. Trick 2. Fermented banana water, the living inoculant. If the first trick is about concentrating nutrients, the second trick is about waking up biology. This is where fermented banana peel water becomes so useful, because it is not just a simple liquid feed. It is a living inoculant for the soil. You may have seen gardeners make banana peel tea by dropping a peel into plain water and leaving it there for a few days. The problem is that this method does very little. Potassium is held inside the plant tissue, and water alone does not simply pull it all out. Those nutrients need to be released through microbial breakdown. That is why fermentation matters. When banana peels ferment in water with very little oxygen, two things happen at the same time. The plant cells begin to break down, helping release potassium and phosphorus, and the liquid becomes active with beneficial bacteria, yeasts, and enzymes. The method is simple. Chop a few banana peels into smaller pieces, place them in a large glass jar, and cover them completely with filtered water. To feed the microbes, add a spoonful of sugar or organic molasses. Cover the jar loosely so gas can escape, then keep it in a cool, dark place for 1 to 2 weeks. You will know it is working when small bubbles appear on the surface and the smell becomes sweet and sour, almost like a mild vinegar. At that point, you are no longer just soaking kitchen scraps. You are creating a biological soil booster. Strain the liquid, dilute it well, using about 1 part ferment to 5 or 10 parts water, then pour it around the base of your plants. Studies have shown that fermented banana peel solutions can improve root length, leaf size, and overall plant vigor in tomatoes and other vegetables. And because this liquid brings active biology into the soil, it also supports the tiny organisms that help feed earthworms. It takes a little patience, but for a gardener who wants living soil, the payoff is powerful. Part 5. Trick 3. The planting hole deposit. The slow-release root engine. The third trick is one of those once-a-season opportunities that many gardeners overlook. I call it the planting hole deposit. Every spring, we dig holes for young tomato, pepper, or vegetable transplants, place them in the ground, and cover the roots. But those first 6 to 8 weeks after transplanting are extremely important. This is when the plant either builds a strong, deep root system or struggles to establish itself. A buried banana peel can be very useful here because it works like a slow-release nutrient source placed right where future roots will grow. But it must be done correctly. Place 1 or 2 chopped banana peels at the very bottom of the planting hole. Then cover those peels with a few inches of soil before setting the young plant above them. That soil layer is important. As the peel begins to decompose, it can temporarily tie up a small amount of nitrogen. So the buffer protects tender young roots from sitting directly on fresh, decomposing material. Over the next several weeks, the buried peel turns into a small decomposition hotspot underground. Earthworms are naturally drawn to these rich pockets of organic matter. They move toward the peel, tunnel through the surrounding soil, improve aeration, and leave behind nutrient-rich castings close to the root zone. So you are not only giving the plant a slow supply of potassium and phosphorus, you are creating a small underground engine of worm activity exactly where the plant will need it most. No repeated applications, no complicated schedule. Just one smart deposit at planting time, and the soil continues releasing value through the season. Part 6. Trick for Vermicomposting. Creating a worm utopia. The first 3 tricks bring banana peels directly into the garden, but trick number 4 completes the whole cycle. This is vermicomposting, which means letting worms do the heavy work for you. Earthworms, especially red wigglers and African nightcrawlers, are some of the best soil builders a gardener can work with. Give them organic waste, and they turn it into worm castings, one of the richest and most biologically active soil amendments you can add to your garden. Banana peels are attractive to worms because they contain carbohydrates and proteins. In fact, scientific experiments have shown that banana-rich feed can increase worm growth and reproduction. In one study, adding 1,000 milliliters of banana peel pulp produced the highest worm biomass and resulted in more than 200 worm cocoons per container. But this is where experience matters. If you feed worms the wrong way, the system can backfire. Do not throw large amounts of whole raw banana peels into a worm bin. They break down slowly, create odor pockets, and can attract fruit flies. The better method is freeze and thaw. Chop the peels into small pieces and freeze them for at least 24 to 48 hours. As the water inside the plant cells freezes, it expands and helps break open the tough cell walls. Freezing can also kill fruit fly eggs that may be hiding on the peel. When the peels thaw, they become soft, mushy, and much easier for the worm bin ecosystem to process. Worms do not chew like we do. They pull in softened food and rely on grit, such as finely crushed eggshells, to help grind material in their gizzards. So mix a little crushed eggshell into the thawed banana mush, then bury it deep under dry brown bedding such as shredded newspaper or cardboard. This keeps the sweet smell away from pests and gives the worms a balanced, softened meal. Inside the worm system, digestive enzymes and microbes begin breaking down the carbon, creating a burst of biological activity. You feed the worms feed the soil, and the soil grows stronger plants for you. That is the loop of life working exactly as it should. Part 7, Trick 5, Banana Peel Biochar. The ultimate 24-hour soil reset, but what if your soil is already worn out? What if it dries hard before midday? Water runs through it instead of soaking in, and the earthworms that used to be there seem to have disappeared completely. When that happens, your soil is not just low in nutrients. It has lost structure, moisture balance, and living biology. That brings us to the final and most powerful trick. Banana Peel Biochar, the 24-hour soil reset. When you use raw banana peels, they eventually break down and vanish into the soil. But when you turn those peels into biochar, you create something very different. Instead of disappearing, the peel becomes a stable, mineral-rich carbon framework that can remain in the soil for hundreds of years. To make it, first dry your banana peels completely. Then place them in a metal container with a tight-fitting lid and only a tiny pinhole for pressure to escape. Heat the container over a fire until the peels are fully carbonized, meaning they are heated with very little oxygen. Once the smoking stops and everything cools completely, crush the charred peels into small granules. This process turns organic material into carbon filled with tiny microscopic pores. Those pores become shelter for microbes and fungi. They help hold moisture without drowning the roots, while still allowing oxygen to move through the soil. Because banana peel biochar is softer and more mineral balanced than many wood-based biochars, it can begin improving soil behavior surprisingly quickly. But there is one critical step many gardeners skip. Biochar must be charged before it goes into the soil. Fresh, uncharged biochar is empty and hungry. If you mix it straight into the garden, it can temporarily pull nutrients away from your plants. So before using it, soak the crushed biochar in compost tea or fermented banana peel water for at least 12 hours. That way, the tiny pores become filled with nutrients and living biology. For a 5-gallon container, mix just 1 tablespoon into the top 3 inches of soil. For a raised bed, use about 1 cup per 10 square feet. Within 24 hours, moisture begins to stabilize. Tight areas of soil start to loosen, and earthworms, which are highly sensitive to oxygen and moisture, are encouraged to return to that zone. Biochar does not simply feed the soil for a short time. It becomes part of the long-term architecture of your garden. Conclusion: look at what we have uncovered today. From the ancient growers of Cook Swamp more than 7,000 years ago to the science we understand in modern agriculture, the lesson has been in front of us all along. Real fertility is built by biology. It comes from microscopic bacteria, quiet earthworm tunnels, active fungi, slow mineral release, and organic matter returning to the ground. No expensive bag of fast-dissolving synthetic salt can fully replace a living, breathing soil ecosystem. The multi-billion-dollar potash industry depends on a cycle where gardeners buy soluble nutrients, lose some of them through watering and rain, then come back to buy more. But we do not always have to stay trapped in that cycle. We can begin rebuilding fertility with something many people throw away every morning. Think about the system we created. Dried banana peel powder gives the garden a concentrated source of potassium. Fermented banana water brings soluble nutrition and living biology to the root zone. The planting hole deposit creates a slow-release nutrient engine exactly where young plants need support. The worm bin turns kitchen waste into dark, rich castings. And banana peel biochar creates a lasting structure where moisture, oxygen, microbes, and roots can work together for years. So tomorrow morning, when you finish eating a banana, what will you do with that peel? Will you throw it away, or will you use it to wake up the soil? If this video helped a seed of knowledge grow for you today, please subscribe, like this video, and share it with another gardener who is trying to bring tired soil back to life. Thank you so much for joining me here on Earthly Delights. Keep exploring, keep growing, and I will see you in the garden next time.